Hi everyone. Thanks for coming back and hopefully for listening. And I've got a bit of a different presentation in that this isn't a Tate Lyle presentation. So, you know, excuse my slides and you'll see why as we go through. But I wanted to do something about some of the experiences that I've had through my career and share those with you. But before I go into that, I just wanted to thank my parents for the fact that I'm here. And I don't mean just because I'm here, but because my mum's from Scotland, she's from Edinburgh, and my dad's from England, from Essex. And without really knowing it as a child, I was experiencing, particularly at family events, the challenges of people who even seemingly speak the same language, trying to understand and communicate effectively with each other. And I think that's where my interest in languages and communication has come from. We still have some challenges, but you know, that's the way it is. So when I was asked if I could talk about managing a global workforce, I was thinking, you know, what's interesting for me about that is how we communicate with people, or think we communicate, and then somehow fail to make the mark. And we make a lot of investment in things like training and what's our corporate vision, and lots of gloss and glamour, but does the message really get home to people? So that's what I kind of wanted to give some insights into in my experience. So there's so many ways of saying hello, and when you're trying to convey a more complicated message, then things can get really lost in translation as you go further down the line. So does anybody know this word and how to pronounce it? I thought you might do. Yeah. Has anybody else come across this? No. So this is fish, pronounced fish. And it's English, okay, and everybody understands English that's here, right? And the reason it's English is because this is the f, as in trough, or laugh, depending where you come from. This is I, as in women. And this is sh, as in station, stationery, lotion, and so many other examples. And when you think about our language as English, for those of you that are first language as English, it's really easy to forget the challenges you had learning as a child because you just dealt with them as you go along. And if any of you have got children or deal with younger children as you maybe go in and help reading in schools and so on, you'll see and get reminded of the variations we have in our language that just make no sense whatsoever. So when we go out to talk to other people in different countries and we try to talk to them in English or provide information written in English, it's easy also to forget that we need to maybe change the wording, change the way we do things a little bit. So what I'd like to do is tell you some stories from my journey in my career. And I started out working in Russia for PepsiCo. It wasn't my plan, but that's how I got there. And it was partly because I'd studied Russian and business at university. And I had a year's contract to go and do mass recruitment in Russia for PepsiCo, starting out in Moscow, so there's St. Basil's on Red Square. And that was the easy part, Moscow, because you could advertise for jobs in English. There were newspapers. This was pre-internet, so I'm talking dark ages now. And you could put things into print. People would apply in English. CVs were typed up. Again, old days. And you could conduct your interviews in English. And there was a good a range of talented people who had experience in business and the roles that you were looking for, as well as being able to speak English to the foreign managers that had come in to set up the business. Once you go outside of Moscow, or did at that time, it was a different story. Not just in terms of language capability, but simple things like actually reaching your target audience to be able to attract people to apply to PepsiCo. I have many stories, but I've only got a short period of time, so I'll just try and give you a couple. There was a particular city that I went to called Krasnoyarsk, which is kind of fairly central, and there was no kind of typical newspaper that everybody read. There was no real way of knowing how to attract people to apply to PepsiCo. But there was a particular program that was very popular on TV in the region. And so my colleagues and I decided we'd go to the TV station and book a scrolling advert across the bottom of this particular program. That was great. We got loads of applications, people wrote to us, and our next thing was to go back again and run assessment centres. And these were Again, old days, paper and pencil assessment centres. And PepsiCo had done some real work with the University of Vienna to develop something that meant we had a kind of screening process. And for PepsiCo, the two deal breakers were about flexibility and integrity. And so we would invite people first to sit in an assessment centre and then shortlist down to interviews. But going back to trying to contact the people that had applied, again, not many had telephones. And so because of the time frames that we had to handwrite telegrams and take them to the post office and ask the ladies in the post office to then use their machines and send these off to people so that we could get them to these assessment centres within that particular visit. Now, bear in mind, we were doing recruitment right across Russia, so we had quite a tight time schedule with travel going from one city to the other to try and do all of these startups on time. So initially we went to the post office and stood in the queue, as you normally do, and then went and asked the ladies to do these telegrams for us. We'd written them up, took us ages trying to write Cyrillic and make it presentable. And they just looked at us, the three ladies there, and said, no, we're too busy. And we were kind of in disbelief saying, well, but this is your job, you know, this is what you're here for, and we're in the queue, and so you kind of need to. And no, adamant that they wouldn't. Again, very different time, different way of working, and there was no manager to say, customer service, come on, let's do what we need to do. So we had to go away and rethink what we were doing. And the problem wasn't in our language, we were speaking Russian to them, they understood what we wanted, there was no issue. And we had missed out on kind of understanding what was important to them, and they wanted to feel valued and appreciated. So the next day we went back with very long stem roses and nice boxes of chocolates and big smiles and, you know, complimenting them all. And that was fine. And throughout the day, they did batches for us, sent the telegrams, we did the assessment centres, and so on and so forth. And we were able to start up a bottling operation in Krasnoyarsk eventually. But, you know, the issue there wasn't obviously about the language. It was about understanding culture and what was important to them. And we had to adjust our approach to do that. After Russia, I went on to Kazakhstan. And same thing, same assessment, still with PepsiCo to do startups then across Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Kazakhstan's the size of Europe, so pretty huge area to cover. And there were 5 different sales and distribution centres to set up in Kazakhstan. So again, each place was very different. And at the time, Almaty was the capital. It's now been moved north to a place called Astana, which is more central. But Almaty is the picture with the mountains in the background. And I lived there for a couple of years and I loved it. And Oliver talking earlier about, you know, kind of what you've got visually around you in the outdoors. I used to love looking at the mountains when I was having a bad day at work. So Kazakhstan, why have I got cars and relaxation? Because I'll start with relaxation. So in the recruitment, again, at that time, Russian was the language in Kazakhstan. You know, Kazakh had kind of been phased out through the Soviet Union. So we were able to go and do these assessment centres, invite people to them, and we were seeing a real difference in the results because hardly anybody was getting a decent score or any kind of score on the integrity question. And it just didn't seem to fit. So we started to ask a few people and just invite them for interviews just to see if their results kind of tallied with what was coming out in this result for us. And eventually we were asking about the questions and how people understood them. And there was one particular question that was meant to be interpreted as something like, in my free time, I like to relax. And that was fine, went down well in Russia, all okay, clear and understood. The interpretation in Kazakhstan was, in my free time, I like to take drugs. So completely different answer from most people. So having learnt that, we were able to make that adjustment and move forward. But it was, again, a key learning for us and for PepsiCo in the region that although we'd developed something and it was in the right language, we'd shifted culturally and the fit was different and it didn't work so well. So really key learning for me in an early stage of my career. And the other thing I've got is around cars, because I've got a confession to make about, you know, my recruitment skills. PepsiCo was a long time ago, so it's fine. So we were going to hire salespeople. We were going to bring company cars in. They were being driven across Europe to get there. It was all going to be really lovely. So, of course, as I was recruiting salespeople, I was asking them if they had a driving licence. And, of course, hired them if they had a driving licence and fitted all the other criteria. And as we got closer and closer to the cars arriving, a few months down the road, one of our sales managers was starting to act really strangely, very stressed and very agitated. And eventually it turned out that he had a driving licence, but he'd never driven a car. Because, unbeknown to me, you could buy a licence for $50, and lots of people did that. So again, a learning experience to not just ask the question based on my experience of my country and my knowledge, but to go a bit further with the questioning and get the clarity that I was looking for. So we resolved the situation, it was okay. Oops. So then I went later on, further on in my career, I went to work in Tanzania. I worked for Barclays Africa, again another startup, starting the bank up in Tanzania. Lovely experience. And again, some more pictures just to kind of remind me what it was like and what I did. So Dar es Salaam is the city picture. Not sure for the beach, but I did have a few weekends in Zanzibar and a short safari. So these are all just lovely reminders. But again, very different culturally from where I come from, where I grew up, and also from my experience in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Switzerland along the way. And the question I've got here about just a handshake, again, applies to the recruitment process that was applied. So Barclays was looking for a new way of working, and Tanzania was an opportunity to start afresh in Africa and then replicate that in existing banks in other countries. So what we were looking to do was hire people with the right attributes rather than previous banking experience, because we didn't want to bring in the bad habits that they had, and typically one bank would hire from another, and so you just kind of deepened those habits by moving people around. So I did some work with the management team that were going to be hiring people, so they adjusted their way of recruitment, set up things like assessment centres for people. And that was a different way of observing how people worked together as a new team in a startup. And the handshake was really, quite a mind changer in some cases, because there are different ways of shaking hands. And I experienced that when I met people for the first time and interviewed them. So the difference between just a normal hand-to-hand handshake, or a handshake when the other person puts their hand on top of your arm, which means they kind of consider themselves superior to you, or whether they put their hand under your arm when they are looking up to you and slightly deferential. And so when we brought people into these assessment centres, so they were competing for jobs together, but they're in front of us, one of the things we also were able to look at was how people shook hands. And so somebody could have done a really great job in an interview, but then when you saw how they would be with their potential colleagues as well as competitors, it also showed you whether they had good respect for other people, or whether they already assumed they were somehow superior, and you were maybe lining things up for the future that would be issues as well. So a different point on the communication. It's not just the language again, there's other assets to that. More recently with Tate Lyle, we were putting in place some recruitment and assessment tools, particularly for our finance and sales functions. So to really strengthen the profiles of people we were bringing in, and also to make sure we had people in place who were already there, who were ready or could be ready to go into more of a business partnering role in the future, in finance particularly. So we were looking for their potential as business partners. So within the various assessments with verbal reasoning, there were case studies to undertake, some analysis of data, and teamwork. And from this, those that were with us already or joining, we could develop good plans for what needed to happen next to help them get to that business partner level. And in sales, we, again, globally, we were looking at numeracy, verbal reasoning, introduced some role play about how effectively people could close the deal, and also if they could negotiate successfully. So it was they're really, really good tools to have, and they've given us some good results. But they were all introduced in English because our business language is English, and you probably experience the same if you've got a business language, a bit of pressure that at a certain level people should speak English because they need to communicate globally within the organisation. But somehow you can miss the best talent and potential, because what we found was people had incomplete assessments. Their feedback was negative compared to what we knew about them, those that were working with us already, and therefore their development plans were inaccurate because they were really focusing on the wrong things. And in going back and talking to people about their experience and the differences in the schools, it again transpired that people were feeling more tested on their English than on their functional skill and ability. And so we needed to change that. The same thing in sales as well. So change that and move to the own language option, so people could take the relevant parts, and even in the role plays where they were interfacing in English, then they were able to answer the questions in English but had the preparation time and the documents to analyse in their own language, so they actually understood what they were talking about first, rather than that being a test for them. So that resulted in a great change for us, and really heightened the experience for the candidates, but obviously also the results that we were getting as an employer and continue to get within the business. So I've put here, there's endless, obviously, as you know, endless situations where clear communication really matters. But we spend a lot of money on our budgets and get pushed back on our budgets for training and development and so on and so forth. But I quite often push back, and I'm sure some of you do as well, when you're dealing with other countries, on what is it, what's the benefit you're trying to get out of a training session? Well, of course, it's for people to be able to understand better and improve what they're doing. It's not for them to understand English and show that they can understand English. So if we want people to improve and we want them to do things differently, we need to make sure those messages are getting across really clearly and are really understood, and take the feedback from that as well. So on the good news side, things like training and development, benefit rewards, and when there are business successes, really celebrating them, but also letting people know how they contributed and how they fit into that success of the business. And that way, of course, you also improve your engagement. And again, people will spend a fair bit of money on engagement surveys and doing action planning sessions and so on. But if people don't really get the basis of it, you've lost an opportunity. Also, bad news, restructuring, reorganisation. Going through a recent example where we've had some restructuring in a few different countries in Europe, and the communications team doing a great job making sure that the managers were all aligned on what the message was, but had somehow missed planning the translation, which we managed to get in, but it meant pushing back the deadline for delivering what we needed to do. Because you can't feasibly stand up in front of 100 people whose jobs are affected and not allow them the best opportunity to understand what's happening. It's bad news, people react differently, and they need time to absorb it. But also, if it doesn't mean anything or doesn't make sense, that makes it even harder, and then the reactions are worse. So we did some good work with the comms team around getting the translations done, and also in country where needed, getting somebody in to do simultaneous translation with the managers who were going over, so that people could ask their questions from the heart and as they really meant them, and have that conveyed accurately to the manager to then be able to answer, rather than trying to do their best English and maybe not getting across what they meant. I've also put, again, about poor results and what needs to be done. If we want change to be made, we need to communicate that differently and clearly, and avoiding accidents. So at Tate Lyle, we have a really strong safety culture, and unfortunately we've had some fatalities in the last few years, and it's been a real driver in the business to make sure that we don't just communicate about safety, but again, the training programs about safety are done locally in local language, and we've seen a real change in the results on our safety and reported near misses. I put the intranet there also on the good news. Obviously, intranet could be a bit old-fashioned. There's lots of apps and different things now that companies use. We saw, obviously, from Google earlier, the dream that I'm sure many of us would like to have of things being available. And talking of Google and other companies where you can obviously do instant translations, another learning just I'd like to share, and you may have experienced already, is when you want to understand something and you do a quick free translation, or you want to send a message to somebody in their own language, by all means do that free translation, but then copy it, paste it and translate it back and see if it means the same thing before you send it to anybody, because it can really change. And you can have some humorous situations, but sometimes they're not always humorous. So what matters, a number of things kind of touched on here, you know, about the language. Language to me is really important, but not everybody will speak multiple languages. Or as we evolve and our businesses move globally, we might not have the language for a particular market that we're, you know, moving into, and we're meant to lead a project that goes in there. So we're not expected to all be masters of languages around the world, but to have some understanding and even to be able to say the basics of please and thank you and how are you, great. Understanding culture is a key thing. And again, where companies will move expats, experts to another country who don't have prior experience of that, it's very easy for that person to come in with a clear goal of what they need to achieve in their function, but actually not understanding the country that they're coming into first. And without some understanding of the culture, the history, what matters locally, you can really delay the process of development by getting things wrong with people. I'll give an example again of Kazakhstan, where we were hiring some great people, but finding it difficult to get people to put forward their ideas about their market and what would work, what would be successful, what else they saw in the market. And it was again by just talking to one person in particular and asking him to try and get an understanding of why that was the case. And he spoke very openly about the fact that his grandparents had been, in the former Soviet times, they'd expressed opinions and they'd been taken away to the Gulag and he'd never seen them since. So there was a real emotive thing there and a real fear factor, which of course had gone, but the fear was still ingrained somehow culturally. And so we had to work with people to create that trust and build that trust, and then show that when they gave ideas, we acted on those ideas as well. But again, going in without really having that understanding or thinking about it just meant we weren't getting what we could and getting the best out of people. Key things, listening and understanding. Again, it's easy to go into another country and tell people what you're there to do, but really important to listen to what they'd like to get or hear about their market and what their views are about the market and understand what's different. You know, we all can easily go to somewhere and our views are formed by what we've grown up with, what we know, what we're used to and our norms, and there can be things that are completely different. So for me, the things like the driving license example, you know, and there were others. And feedback, so making sure, again, people really do understand what you intend in the same way, and having that open and two-way communication. And these are all things we talk about in our companies, I'm sure all the time. When we're talking about performance reviews and feedback, it's all two-way. But if we can do that and make sure people are able to do that in a way that they're comfortable with and they can express themselves most fully, then we get the best out of people as well. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening.